Hello, and welcome to another episode of Generation Cult, a show about people who grew up in controlling groups, also known as cults. I'm Dhyana, and today we're going to be speaking with someone I met this year in Portland, Oregon. His name is Jesse, and he grew up in a very small organization in the Midwest called the Church of Jesus Christ Forever. It's historically been named by outsiders as the Cult of Oregon because of its location, not in the state of Oregon, but in the city of Oregon, Illinois. Trigger warning. This episode is a difficult one to get through. Jesse went through some pretty humiliating abuse as a teen, so please listen with care. That said, I am very happy to welcome Jesse here to tell his story. And there's a lot to cover, so we're just going to get into it. Hi, Jesse. Thank you for being here.
Thank you so much for having me.
So you grew up in a really small group in a small town that is confusingly named Oregon, Illinois.
Yes, it is. And I now live in Portland, Oregon.
Before we get into your personal story, I'd like to talk a little bit more about the organization. So what do you know about its history? Who started it?
It actually started as a Bible study in Rockford, Illinois. And it was just a very, very small Bible study located in the basement of, I believe, one of my relatives, actually. And there was a female there named Rose Jones, and she took control of the Bible study as the leader. And as more people began attending the Bible study, they ran out of space. So they moved to a farmhouse in the outskirts of Oregon, Illinois. And once the group of people outgrew the farmhouse, they prayed for an actual church building. And apparently, a voice came into a car of a Buddhist monk and said to give his building to Rose Jones. And so somehow the building that the church prayed for was given to them in Oregon, Illinois. And that's where it's located today.
And what's the group called?
The Church of Jesus Christ Forever.
And who is this Rose Jones person?
That's a very interesting question. She passed away when I was 6 years old. So the stories that I know about her were, she was a very devout woman of God. She became a pastor. God spoke to her very young about her calling as a spiritual leader. Over the years, she was married several times, had several kids. Somehow she found her way to Rockford, Illinois, where she found the Bible study, gained control of it, however that looks, and then founded the Church of Jesus Christ Forever in Oregon, Illinois. And that would have been I believe the Bible study was in the late 70s, and then the church was founded in the 80s, I believe. I believe the building was given to the church in the 80s.
And at what point did anyone in your family get involved in this?
So my mom was actually one of the first people to join the Bible study because I believe that she was related to the relative of mine where the Bible study originally was at, in the basement of a home in Rockford, Illinois. So my mom was there early on, and she was actually a stewardess based in Honolulu. And so she met a man named Kalialuli, married him. They moved back to Rockford, Illinois, where they joined this Bible study. And ultimately, Kalialuli, my mom's husband, became the assistant leader of the Bible study in Rockford and ultimately became the pastor. So Kalialuli is the current pastor of the church.
Oh, okay. It's complicated. I remember that. I remember that it gets complicated.
Yes.
Okay, so let's talk about the ideology a little bit before we go any further. You mentioned when we talked earlier that it aligned with charismatic Pentecostal. What does that look like for a typical service?
That's a very good question because it's so different than any other church I've ever been to. I grew up knowing that when I went to a church service, I had the right to stand up in church and prophesy or minister to someone or pray for someone, because in the Bible it talks about, everyone brings a psalm or a prophecy or a prayer or something. And so the church that I grew up in believed that if during the week, you read the Bible and you prayed and you were faithful to God, God would be faithful to you and give you, something to speak to someone at church. And so come Sunday or, whatever day that church meetings were, everyone would get up and minister to each other. So whether that was prophesying in tongues or prophesying about the future or praying or ministering. Everyone from the youngest to the oldest had to do that. And a lot of the times, speaking in tongues and casting out devils was the normal practice during church sessions. So that was something that we believed that we could do, is speak in tongues. That was the heavenly language, your personal language between you and God, as well as the ability to cast out devils, heal the sick, everything that Pentecostal charismatics believe in. That's what we practice, just a little bit more extreme. Oh boy, I remember a moment where we had a visitor and someone in the church stood up and said, God told me that you need to be baptized in the Holy Spirit. And so you need to be able to speak in tongues. And this guest was a bit uncomfortable and said that they weren't ready to do that, but the church member wouldn't relent. So they forced the issue. And when they forced the issue, everyone else in the church forced the issue as well. So this guest just must have, felt so uncomfortable, so bewildered that, here he is just wanting to attend a church service and people are trying to force the Holy Ghost on him when he wasn't ready. So I believe it ended very uncomfortably. I think he walked out of the church because the members of the church wouldn't let it go. But at the end of this conversation in the church, they symbolically wiped the dust off their feet. According to the Bible says, if they don't receive you, wipe the dust off their feet. And so so the church wiped their dust off their feet and the guest left. So in that regard, it seems extreme because they were very forceful with the theology.
Mm. So everyone in the church was just very, I guess it sounds like aggressive with what they wanted other people in the church to do. Very
Yes.
verbal.
Yes. The very verbal,
You do
very,
this.
not to the point of some other organizations that you see, like let's say Westboro Baptist Church, where they might be out on the street, casting slurs at people, but aggressive to the point of if they believe that God told them to do something or to say something, they would do it. And they don't necessarily care about who they offend or what the consequences are because God told them to do these things.
You said this was really small. About how big was this church?
When I was growing up, so before the female pastor passed away, there were probably around 60 people. So there were maybe roughly 8 families with a few individuals. As soon as she passed away, the church split in half because half of the church didn't agree with Kalialuli taking over as the leader, and the other half were very, loyal to him. So it dwindled down to probably 40 people.
And it still exists, right?
It does. It still exists. So funny enough, Oregon, Illinois has always been the home base for the church, but back in the early 2000s, someone prophesied that Hawaii would be the new location for the church. So the church would eventually, move over there. And so most of the church members have actually moved to Hawaii. You have, I don't know, a handful of people still in Oregon, Illinois. You have a handful of people around the United States, just random families that are placed in different states because of their employment. But then you have quite a few people in Hawaii. And as I've told other people, when you come from the Midwest with nothing but cornfields and someone stands up and says that Hawaii is the promised land, you would be a fool to deny that.
Mm.
I mean, of course it's going to be the promised land.
Yeah, Hawaii's nice.
Mm-hmm.
And this group hasn't completely flown under the radar. You sent me some articles from back in 1987. One involved a murder, or it mentioned that someone was murdered. And then there was another one about some grandparents who were concerned about not seeing their family members. Although widely, I don't feel like I've heard a lot about this group. How did you dig this information up, or how did you come across this?
So primarily the group has flown under the radar. It's a very small town, Oregon, Illinois. It's, I don't know, 3,000, 4,000 people. There's not much to it. But with the forming of the church back in the late 70s or early 80s, there was a female pastor, which at the time was very controversial. And so it was labeled as a cult very early on. But also, a lot of people visited and were able to leave. And so stories circulated about how controlling the church was and how there was limited access to family members within the church. So people started talking, newspaper articles were written about the lack of access to family members and how the family members inside the church were told to disown their family members outside of the church. There's a lot of excommunication, and that still happens today. And so there were multiple newspaper articles written, and there was one woman who had mental health issues who died by suicide. Ultimately, her family members had stated I believe that in a weird way, the church murdered her because they took away her right to express herself and to communicate with her family members. So not
Oh,
necessarily that they murdered her in the first degree, I guess you would call it, but
they're responsible
in a
for
way
the death.
for that because of how controlling and extreme the church was.
I see. Okay. So were you doing research on the group? You found it?
So as I was growing up, I was never allowed to question anything. And so I, constantly lived with the fear that if I doubted or if I questioned, I would be judged by God and ultimately go to hell. So as I went through my teen years, I started to actually have those doubts. And when I ultimately left the church, I did a little bit of research on the church. And we had heard about the cult rumors, my whole life. And we had to deal with students in school, knowing that we were cult members. So over the past 10 years, I have been involved in filing police reports about abuse that happened in the church to me, as well as trying to shed light on this very small cult to raise awareness. So, through that process, I came across multiple news articles. I had quite a few people who gave me different resources with information about this church. I actually read a book that was called Churches That Abuse, and within this book, the Church of Jesus Christ was mentioned as a small charismatic church in the Midwest where the female pastor was known as this mother figure to a lot of the adults there. That's how it was. So to this day, this female pastor is still looked at as a very maternal figure. So there's so much information about the church if you know where to look and if you know a lot of the history and the names of people within the church.
Mm. Has anyone been successful in bringing it down in any way or filing anything against the church?
A lot of people have tried. No one has been successful. If you look when you discuss religion, you have to tread very carefully because at what point is your right to practice religion a violation of other people's rights to believe that? At what point does it become abuse? And so when I first left the church, I decided not to talk about it. I was just going to move on with my life. There, a lot of us who have left still have family members within the church that we love. My mom is still in the church. I love her to death. The last thing I would like to see is anything happen to my mom. And so we all just decided to, keep our stories to ourselves and deal with the pain in our own way and just move on. But over the past few years, we've become a little bit more vocal about it and we filed police charges. Ultimately, there's a statute of limitations, and the Oregon Police Department stated that they found no abuse within their jurisdiction within the statute of limitations. So nothing could actually be done about this, which is, very disappointing for all of us because we'd like to see this church be disbanded and the people responsible just held to the extent of the law. And we don't know that that is going to happen. So a lot of failed attempts at trying to take this church down.
Well, we can at least talk about your experience.
Mhm.
So let's do that.
Yeah.
So, what was it like growing up in this church? Earliest memories when you were a kid? What did you think?
Actually, my earliest memories were of the female pastor of Rose and how, looking back, it seems like we worshiped her. I remember being in church and wanting to get up in church and say something nice about Rose because I wanted that maternal praise. I wanted the affection that I knew she would show to anyone who gave her a word. And so I remember thinking, what if I had a vision of Rose driving down the road and everyone was cheering for her? And I thought about saying that. I don't remember, if I actually said that, but I thought about saying it to be able to get her praise. So life early on, I would say, before the age of 6, I don't really have that many negative memories. It seems like it was smooth sailing. I feel like I was happy.
What was the living situation like? Did you guys just live with your own families and wasn't communal or?
There was an aspect of communal living, which is strange. All the parents worked at Maxon Manor, which is a local restaurant in Oregon, Illinois. I believe that Rose Jones owned or co-owned this restaurant, and all the parents in the church agreed to work for low wages at this restaurant to be able to pay off the loan on the restaurant. So all of our parents lived there. They had to figure out a way for all of us kids, to be babysat as we were growing up. And so Rose owned a portion of an island south of Oregon. And I remember that they built a bunkhouse on the island, and there was an individual home on the island. And I remember all of us during the summers, all of us kids being brought to this island to be babysat. I believe I was actually baptized at this island. There was a pool. And that's just how we spent our summers on this island. We spent them all day there. Each family of children had their own room in this bunkhouse, and the parents would get off work really late and they'd come over to the island and we'd all have dinner and celebrations together. For the most part, I think it was kind of carefree. I remember small things like, getting in trouble and being told to go pick a switch
Mm.
from the tree. I remember that. I remember the pool that we all swam in, but it was very, very communal living on this island. Aside from that, everyone had their individual homes in Oregon, Illinois.
At this point, did people know about the group, the people in Oregon, Illinois?
Yes.
Tell me about the town's relationship with the group.
So the town's relationship, from my earliest memories, I remember there being some level of controversy because Rose was a female pastor in the 80s, and that was just very controversial. That was unheard of. People had a very conservative theology of who should be leading a church. And here was this female pastor leading a church, and she was this older woman, and she was also very wealthy. And so there were a lot of rumors surrounding her wealth and her ability to control the people in the church. And so it wasn't openly hostile walking down the street for us, but there were always glances or whispered rumors here and there. So everyone knew who we were. There was no hiding it. It's a town of 3,000 people.
Were there a lot of kids in the group?
Oh, yeah. Oh, there's so many. Oh, one family had 7 kids. My mom there were 5 of us. Other families, there were just so many kids.
Were you homeschooled or did you go to public school?
Yeah, so we all went to public school, and the idea behind that was that they should be, quote unquote, in the world but not of the world. And so, we never were homeschooled. We were always taught to be part of Oregon, Illinois. If we seclude ourselves, it was going to create more controversy. So there were moments where in my 8th grade year and my senior year, I was homeschooled. And then I believe now, actually, the kids that remain in Oregon, Illinois are homeschooled. So I don't know at what point that ideology changed.
Did you interact with other people or did you kind of stick to your community within the church?
No, I definitely interacted with other students. I mean, everyone knew us as the Cult of Oregon. That phrase was used quite a bit. So the Cult of Oregon, everyone in school knew that we were cult members. But I was bullied. There were different rumors that, different students would approach me with and say, "Hey, I heard you guys dress in robes and you stand around with torches." And none of that stuff was true. Those are the fun ones. None of that stuff was true, but there was always some level of attempted justification on our parts, stating that we would pray, we'd minister, we'd prophesy. So we had to defend ourselves in school. But I did have friends in public school, and it was my outlet. I mean, there was so much happening in my private life with the church that public school was a way for me to get it all out. So that came with, bad grades and not focusing on my studies. It was I suppose, my rebellious years.
What was going on with your home life?
So in 92 or 93, Rose died, and it was prophesied that she could, quote unquote, never die, that she was going to have eternal life, but then she died. So that kind of shattered that prophecy. And they believed that she was going to raise from the dead. So 3 days after she died, we all gathered at church and we watched her open casket, waiting for her to stand up. She never did. That was in 1993. It's 2024, and she still hasn't risen from the dead. So I suppose they're all holding their breath, waiting for that to happen. But
Oh, they're still waiting.
yeah, still waiting. But with that major event of her passing and then Kali taking over, so at some point, my mom divorced Kali, and Kali married Rose. Kali was decades younger than Rose. So he married her, and she died less than a year after they were married, which is suspect.
Yeah. And Cully was your stepdad. So he's not your dad. Your mom was married to him. And then he divorced your mom and then married Rose. And then Rose died.
He was never my stepdad. So
Oh.
I wasn't even born when Kali was married to my mom. Kali was married to my mom in the very early 80s. They divorced, and my mom married my dad and had me.
Ah.
And so, yeah, so he, thankfully, thank God, Kali is not in any way related to me.
Okay. Cool.
Yeah. Yeah, that would just Terrible. So yes, but he ultimately married Rose, and she was, several decades older than him, very wealthy. She died less than a year after they were married, which was, again, very suspect. He got all her money or most of it, and the church split in half. So 20 or 30 people left the church because they didn't want to be under Collier's leadership, where my family stayed along with several other families. And life just became very, very harsh. And, there was a lot of discipline, there was a lot of restrictions on certain things. When I was 6 years old, I celebrated my birthday for the last time. I remember my mom giving me a G.I. Joe and a cake, and that was the very last time I got to celebrate my birthday because we were told never to celebrate birthdays again. That was just not allowed.
Was that explained in any way? Do you remember asking why, or do you remember that being
I
justified?
couldn't ask why. I couldn't ask why, because that'd be doubting or, questioning someone that was taught never to do that. But at some point, maybe they considered it ideology of our, I don't know, of our birthday. I don't remember why. Those are the logical explanations, or, that's focusing too much on ourselves that day. Yeah. We never celebrated Christmas, and just a lot of restrictions. So growing up, there was the idea of perfection was pushed. So Matthew 5:48 in the King James Version Bible, because that is apparently the only Bible that a true Christian is allowed to read, states that be therefore perfect, even as your Father in heaven is perfect. And so that was the scripture that the church lived by, which means that this church believed that they were the called and chosen people that were meant to be perfect in their flesh. And so that idea was pushed on us. And so we had to deny every aspect of our own desires and will and put God's first, so that when we didn't meet those standards, we were disciplined. So there was the normal spankings as a, late 80s, early 90s that I feel like every child dealt with. So whatever, that's fine. But it got more extreme than that. When I was 13, my parents visited Hawaii, and they placed all of his children at different homes in the church to be babysat. And that was the first moment where I was tortured. And it was supposed to be just a very short, just a 2-week trip. But I was told that I needed to change. So, change as in I needed to follow God better. I needed to deny my desires and my will. And so I was told that I was not going to go home until I changed. That meant changing according to the to the church's will, to their standards. So I was called a glutton, and I was told that I didn't know how to control my mouth. And so every time I said something out of turn, or the church felt that I was eating too much food, which, I was a 13-year-old boy.
13.
So
Yeah.
that should explain itself.
Yeah.
Every time, I did anything out of order, I was disciplined at this house. So winter in Illinois, in this massive house that was partially unfurnished. So my bedroom, it was a shared bedroom with another kid in the church, in the basement. So it was freezing down in the basement in a Midwest winter. So I started off, on a bed with blankets and pillow and clothes and whatnot. And every time that I did something wrong, so whether that meant speaking out of turn, or not working fast enough, or not fasting when the church pressured me to fast, they took something away. So it started off with taking my blanket, my pillow, my bed, and I wound up on the floor, on a very thin area rug on a cement floor in this house. And then they took my clothes. And so I remember sleeping in the fetal position for weeks on end, and clothed in just my underwear, and just hugging myself for warmth, just trying to get through the night to where I could put my clothes on again.
It's terrible. That's so
Yeah,
awful.
as a 13-year-old boy. And then they, moved me off of the area rug onto the cement floor itself. And I was taken off the area rug and put on the cement floor, and that was how I was supposed to sleep from then on. So that was at night. In the midst of that, during the daytime, I was pressured into fasting. So the church would talk about how fasting was denying the body's need for food. So it was the most important thing that the body needs. And that was the most devout way to rid yourself of something that was ungodly. And so they would pressure us into fasting, which at that point, if you're being pressured into fasting and you're not doing it willingly, it's just starvation.
Yeah.
And if I didn't fast, I would deal with other additional punishments. So while I was at this house, I was starved. I was forced to sleep on the cement floor. At one point, the parents had me eat this pan of fudge, and I ate it to the point of throwing up and, begging and crying them, just begging them to not make me eat any more fudge. Ultimately, I vomited, and they forced me to drink my vomit. So there was a lot of torture, a lot of abuse while I was at this house. And, I could go on with a bunch of more details, but you get the point. There was
Yeah.
just so much stuff that really, it just scared me.
Yeah. I mean, I know I'm trying to bring logic into a completely illogical situation, but I always wonder in situation like what is supposed to be the point of all this? Was these actions supported by the church? Were they like, yeah, go for it, break this kid's spirit, like this will help? Like I just it just it's just so over the top.
That's essentially what it was breaking my spirit. And I've heard the phrase in the past, tough love. That's essentially what they were trying to do, is give me tough love. So because I wasn't meeting these standards of Christianity, of their idea of Christianity, they wanted to force me into serving God. If I can be put in a position where I realize that my life is hell, then I'll want something better than that. Then I'll seek God, because only God can give me a better life. And so I believe that was their intent, is really to put me in the worst position possible, to force me to turn to God and to, quote unquote, cry out to God to change me and take out these evil teenage puberty feelings.
Yeah. I don't know. Sounds like some sick people to me.
Terrible.
Yeah.
So, because of all these things happening in my personal life, being able to go to public school and have some sense of freedom, there was no one watching me in my classrooms. There was no one watching me in PE class or in the cafeteria. I use those moments to act out, to, I don't know, to just be a boy. And ultimately that got me in trouble. There was no regulation of my behaviors. I guess I didn't know how to express myself. And so when I acted out in school, I would get in trouble. I administration, which they were unaware of what was happening at home. And so they would tell my parents, and my parents had to go to the pastor about it. And so there was just terrible, terrible punishments because of, everything that was happening when I was 13. When I finally was able to leave this home, even though I still believed in everything that the church was comprised of, I told myself that they put me in a position where they could do anything they wanted to me. And I was just going to let it happen. And I told myself that I'd never be put in that position again. I still believed in the church, but I knew that I wasn't going to allow someone to do that to me again. As a 13-year-old boy, I was telling myself that.
So all this was happening to you and you obviously didn't like it, but it didn't make you dislike the church. How did you feel about the people who were doing it, this family you were living with?
I believe that they were right. I was taught that they are the voices or the instruments of God. So whatever they do, God tells them to do so.
Yeah.
And I believe that they were right. I believe that what they were doing was justified. And regardless of whether I could meet their goals, this is what needed to happen. So there wasn't a sense of wrongdoing.
Mm,
It was just a sense of, I suppose, righteous correction. That's the word that was used, correction.
mm. And your parents were on board as well.
So, in a way, my parents were, I suppose, somewhat victims themselves, in that they didn't have full autonomy to raise me how they wanted. They believed in the church, but if a leader in the church told them this is what needs to happen, my parents couldn't question it. My parents weren't in a leadership position. They couldn't fight this. They couldn't argue. They believed that this was God speaking. And so they had to go along with it. Now, that doesn't mean that they're completely free of guilt. You guys are adults, and there has to be some level of responsibility. So my parents didn't have full autonomy to raise me how they wanted. They didn't know a lot of the things that were happening. They just knew that I was at this house because I needed to be corrected, and this family had the right to correct me however they saw fit. Now, granted, the pastor is behind the scenes pulling the strings. And so they were, I would imagine, because I know the family, I know how things work in the church, they would be communicating with him every day, and he would be instructing them on what to do with me. So I finally was able to go home because they gave up on me, which is a really nice win for me. I think they decided that what they were doing wasn't working, so they finally let me go home. Because everything was happening at this home, and I was finally taken out of school while I was being disciplined at this home, I failed my 7th grade year. So in order to catch up to my class, I was homeschooled my 8th grade year, and I completed 7th and 8th grade year in 1 year, and I was able to rejoin my class in public school as a freshman.
Mm.
And then I did my high school years in the public school system with the church. And things weren't as extreme those years as they were when I was 13, but there were ups and downs with the church. I was still not meeting standards and goals, and I was still getting in trouble. There were a few moments where the pastor kicked me out of the church and I was not allowed to attend church meetings. I would have to sit in our family vehicle outside of the church building and wait for the church session to end. And there were times when the church was in a meeting for up to about 6 hours. Oh, this is when it gets really bad. Finally, when I was 17, a lot of the abuse started happening again. Not necessarily a lot of physical abuse, but a lot of spiritual and emotional abuse. I had started having doubts in the church about the belief system and about these people. And so I decided to leave. I ran away from home as a 17-year-old, I think 3 times. Each time I came back. And that final time, this was my senior year of high school. They decided to homeschool me my senior year. So during that year, I ran away from home 3 times. And that third time, I actually took a plane down to Florida from Illinois. And I had just enough money to get down to Florida. In that time there in Florida, I was able to get a job as a construction worker. And without going into all the details, about a month passed and I realized I needed to get back to Illinois. There's a lot of different things that happened in that month. I needed to get back to Illinois. So I made my way up to Illinois, and I had no money. It was the first time that I stayed in homeless shelters, just scared out of my mind. I had been so sheltered in this tiny town that now putting me in a big city in a homeless shelter was just terrifying for me. Day in, day out at this homeless shelter, out on the street panhandling, asking for money. And I knew that I was going to just continue doing this every single day unless I just had one big concerted effort of like, where do I need to be? How do I get home? So one day I panhandled all day long, got enough money to get a bus ticket back home. And I got home. I had called my mom from a payphone and let her know. So I got home, and my mom drove me over to a church member's house where there were several leaders there that questioned me, slapped me, and then stipulated that if I was going to return to the church, that it would be on their terms. So we're now in November of 2004, and they forced me to sleep in a tent in our backyard and defecate in a bucket.
Oh my God.
And it started snowing. Winters are cold in Illinois. Once it got cold, they moved me into a detached garage where I put a space heater in, but the pastor told me that was too comfortable and he took the space heater away.
Wow, that's crazy. And I'm wondering, you're a minor, you're a child while all this is happening. Nobody has noticed that you're being forced into homelessness. You're running away multiple times. You are interacting with people outside the church. You're going to public school. You are showing signs of problems. You're not doing well in school. You're acting out. Has anyone noticed at any point, any teachers, any administrators, I don't know, anyone in the public?
So I learned a couple of years ago that there were a couple of teachers that suspected that something was happening, but they would go to my parents about it, if at all. But these are the people that they would talk to if they needed to. And my parents can't just say that I was being abused. Now, this is just a hypothetical because I don't know if they actually went to my parents and talked to them. But had this situation happened, my parents would have lied to the administration about what was happening at home. I do know that there were 2 teachers or administration officials, whatever, that expressed concern later on in life.
It's so infuriating that this can go on in plain sight. And it's not even like you're isolated off in the woods somewhere. You're interacting with people, and still nothing happens. And you've been completely set up to fail. Like, you have to go back. What else are you going to do?
I also didn't know what resources I had. And I had been taught for so long to believe that these people in the church were the voice of God. And if I come against them, there's a very real chance of going to hell or, face judgment. And so I was more terrified of going to hell and of going against the church that had there been questioning, I don't remember if there was, had there been questioning by counselors in the school, I would have lied about it. I
Hmm.
couldn't go against the church.
Yeah, it's by design that way. You're going to not advocate for yourself. And of course, no one's going to tell you about what resources you might possibly have.
Mhm.
I'm so sorry. Please go on.
Thank you. So I came back, I stayed in the tent for a while in our backyard, and then was moved into the garage. And I don't actually remember how I was able to be let back into the home, but I was. There were still doubts that persisted about the church, but I don't think that I had any resources. I thought that my only resource was this little church. And in 2005, the church had at that point partially moved to Hawaii, and my family was going to go visit them in Hawaii, my whole family. And the pastor called us in and said that I wasn't going to be able to go on the family vacation. And I remember feeling humiliated and so upset that who is this man to tell me that I don't get to go on my family vacation? But they stuck me at a home in Michigan. There was a family that was part of the church. They just lived in Michigan. So I went up there, and the same stipulation was put on me that had been put on me when I was 13, that I didn't get to go home until I changed. And so at that point, I realized that I was going to be put in the same position as I was when I was 13, where people had full control over me and I didn't, get to have a say. And so when I was in Michigan, there was abuse that happened. One instance was the wife rubbed dog feces on my bare chest as a symbolism of what my life was.
Ugh.
So
What is wrong with these people? Like, why?
they'll do anything if they believe that God told them to do it.
Yeah.
So I remember when she did that, she laughed maniacally. And I just remember thinking that there's no way that this can be God, because she's just making fun of me at this point.
It sounds like mental
Yeah.
illness.
Yep. Yep. As soon as she put it on my chest, she just started laughing at me. It was just so humiliating to be, more so than the stuff on my chest. It was so humiliating to be laughed at. And when I was in the shower cleaning it off, I was sobbing, trying to get it off me and knowing that I had to leave. So over the next couple of days, I planned on how I could leave, and I was finally left home alone at this house. And I went into the parents' bedroom and I took these cans of change that I knew I could use to go buy a bus ticket or something. I also took some things that I thought that I could sell to take care of myself. So called a taxi and I got to the bus station and I bought a ticket for California. There was no connection to California. I just needed to leave. I figured, if I could survive in Chicago in a homeless shelter, I can try to do it again in LA, in California. But the family had been looking for me. While I was waiting for the bus, the family had been looking for me. They walked into the bus station. I immediately backed down because that's how I've been trained to do, is to, someone tells me to do something and I do it. So they got on the phone with the pastor, and the pastor promised that things would be better. But as soon as they got to the house, they made me sign a confession saying that I had stolen this money and these items. And they said next time that I ever try to leave the church again, they would turn this confession into the police. So at that point, I was being blackmailed, threatened, whatever. I knew I needed to leave, but my resources, my avenues of leaving were dwindling. I couldn't go to the police because of the blackmail. My license had been taken by the church, so I couldn't leave. I didn't have a phone. I didn't have an email. I had no access to a computer. I had no access to family members who had left the church. They deliberately kept that information from me so I wouldn't turn to them. And then I couldn't go home because my family wouldn't take me. So in my mind, I had no resources. And so I did what I needed to do. I started sneaking out at night and going into cars. I'd have a backpack on me and I would go into these cars that were unlocked. I never broke anything. My intent wasn't to do any damage or anything heinous. I just needed money to leave. And so I found these cars that were unlocked. I grabbed change and I did this over, I don't know, a couple of weeks. I don't remember how long actually. And it progressed to finally going in a person's home to try to get money so I could save up and leave. And I did save up. I hid the money under a bush at a neighbor's house, so I wouldn't be in the room I was in, because they were searching my room. So it all came to a head one day when the wife accused me of doing something that I hadn't done, and I might have been guilty in the past, but I wasn't guilty now. But they stated that God showed them that I did this, and so I was so angry that they accused me of doing something, and they said that God told them that I did it, but I didn't do it, which showed me God doesn't really speak to them. So the husband brought me into the bathroom and held up a knife and threatened to dismember me.
Oh my God.
He said, their intent was to scare me, but as a 18-year-old boy at this point, who believed everything that the church said and who saw over the years the level of aggression by the church grow, whether that was just meetings with the church where they would tell me, how I was sinning, to denying me food and making me sleep on the cement floor, to now holding up a knife.
Yeah.
Of course, I believed that they were going to do
Threatening
it.
you with a knife.
Right.
Yeah.
Why wouldn't I believe that this was going to happen? So I freaked out. I told him I'd call the police. Can't touch me. Can't do anything. He threw me up against the wall and asked me if I wanted to fight. And of course, I said no. And so we left the bathroom and they got on the phone with the pastor. And the pastor said, admit it. You did this. You did this. And I had grown up my whole life believing that the pastor was the voice of God. And I'd never once come against the pastor. And when he told me that I did this, that God showed them
But what were they accusing you of?
masturbation.
Oh, okay.
So yeah, they accused me of masturbating. So
But
um,
but 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 threatening someone with a knife is fine.
so geez, I mean, it just doesn't make sense.
Jesus.
So so at that moment when the pastor told me that, God showed them that I did this thing, which now that you know what it was, like, how did God
Like,
show that? I told the pastor that he was wrong, and I was deathly afraid because how I had been raised. I thought that I was going to die in that moment, and I didn't die. So there's that. The next night, I decided I needed to get out of there.
yeah.
If the level of aggression had progressed over the years and God told them to bring me into the bathroom and dismember me, what happens if God tells them to kill me? They believe in the Bible. And there are moments in the Bible where God told Abram he had to go sacrifice Isaac. So what's to stop them from believing that God tells them to go kill me? That's the only other thing that can happen. And I believed that was going to happen. So the next night, I snuck out of the house and I knew that I needed to do whatever I possibly could to leave. And so I stole a car. That was the only thing that I could do to get away from the church fast. And the only resource that I thought I had, I couldn't go to the bus station again because they were going to find me. I didn't know I could go to organizations. I couldn't go to the police. And so I found a vehicle that was unlocked. I found the keys and I took the vehicle. And I made it, oh man, world's dumbest criminal. I made it one block and there was a police car and they stopped me because my lights were off.
Oh,
Yeah. So, and this was at 1 a.m. So,
oh,
yep, I got caught. I confessed everything. And unfortunately, the way cults and brainwashing work, when I got caught, I believe that God allowed me to get caught because I was wrong for stealing this, which means that if I was wrong, someone had to be right, and that was the church. So in that moment, I believed that everything that the church did, all the abuse, all the threats, I believed that they were right because God allowed me to get caught by the police, which meant I confessed everything. Geez, they didn't need to interrogate. They didn't need to do anything. I just spilled the beans. So the police arrested me. I went to the city jail for 3 days and then was moved to the county jail where I found out that I was going to be charged with 11 felonies. Those included first degree home invasion, breaking and entering, theft of a vehicle, unlawful operation of a motorized vehicle or something. I don't know. They were weird, weird felonies that seemed like they were just stacked on top of each other. So I faced the 11 felonies and I went in front of the judge. And the judge asked me, why I did what I did. And at that point, I just said that I was being stupid. I was just a stupid teenager.
so you didn't feel comfortable saying all these things had happened?
I wish I had. If I had talked about the abuse that was happening, things probably would have gone better for me. So the judge said that I wasn't a hardened criminal. This was my first offense, and he didn't want me to go to jail. What he didn't know was that I was being charged for first degree home invasion, which is technically a violent crime because of what could potentially have happened, not what actually did happen. And I ended up serving 3 years in prison.
Did you have a public defender?
I did. It was terrible. Yeah. I mean, the church they weren't going to support me.
Yeah.
They threw me to the wolves. This was a moment that they could have said, "Hey, Jesse made mistakes," which I didn't make mistakes. Those are choices I made based on the abuse. But this could have been the church saying, "Hey, we're gonna use our lawyer that we retain to support Jesse," and they didn't do it. So they allowed the state of Michigan to throw the book at me, and I served 3 years in prison.
I am so sorry. That's a horrible, horrible story.
Yep. Yeah, it was. Oh my gosh, it was the scariest thing that has ever happened to me. just terrifying. First offense. There were so many times I was almost beat up because I just didn't know things. I didn't know terminology. I didn't know the lifestyle. I didn't know certain, practices. I didn't know that I wasn't supposed to walk by and look in someone's cell. If I heard a noise and I looked over and I saw someone doing something, I would be threatened because people thought that I was snitching. So, oh my gosh, there were moments where I was almost raped. And luckily, there were other people who were witness to it and they intervened and they went and told the officers, or I approached the officers and told them what was going to happen. And so the officers got me out of that situation. And throughout my time in prison, I was so brainwashed that I believed that the church was right, regardless of everything that they did.
So you still believed in them?
Yeah.
Did you think you were supposed to be there?
Yeah. I spent 3 years writing letters to the church, writing letters to my parents, to other members of the church, and just trying to get on their good side again with the hopes that when I got out of prison, I could go home, to them. And ultimately I did, get in their good graces again. And so it benefited me because I had a place to go when I got out of prison. But I mean, it's a harmful environment again. And so I got out of prison and my mom picked me up and we drove down to Oregon, Illinois, and went to the church where they were somewhat of a celebration, I suppose. The first thing they made me do was the pastor told me to get up in front of the church and apologize to the church. I spent 3 years apologizing to church, 3 years writing letters, and I have all the letters. I still have them all.
What were you apologizing for?
For, I don't know, for wronging the church, for committing crimes, for, I don't actually know what I was apologizing for, but I apologized. So I knew that, 3 years later, the church was still the same. The pastor still had his ways of public humiliation. They told me that I really needed to prove myself. And I had this pressure of needing to be perfect. And if I failed at that, that meant that my 3 years was a waste. They would use prison against me, that you're messing up again. So it's so much pressure to not screw up, to meet their standards. And obviously it was impossible.
Was that a red flag at that point? Did you think maybe this isn't the right place for me?
Oh, it was a red flag the day I came home. It was a red flag standing up in front of the church and apologizing, knowing that I was being publicly humiliated for no reason. So the red flags were obvious, but I knew that I was under the stipulation by the parole board that I had to be at this residence, that I had to maintain employment. And so I did what I needed to do to stay and just try to do my best in the church. And, things just got really bad in the church again. They became very verbally, very mentally, and really spiritually abusive. And so I finally decided to leave for good. I believe in October of 2008, because I got out in May of 2008. So October of 2008, I'd heard about MySpace and I didn't have access to a computer, but I had heard about MySpace. And I knew that there were friends and family members who had left the church who probably were on MySpace. So if I could connect with them, I could try to obtain resources to actually leave the church. I secretly went to the public library and created a MySpace account and connected with family members and friends who had left
Oh, great.
and let them know, like, I got to get out. I need to leave. And I was being so controlled that it was just very, very risky to sneak out of the house or find free time to go to the public library. So one day I finally was ready and I made a phone call to the pastor. And we lived in a neighboring town at that point, just my family and I, because of the location of employment. But every weekend we would drive back down to Oregon, Illinois to spend the whole weekend with the church. So at the end of a workday, I called the pastor. I said, "Hey, I'm not coming down to Oregon. I just need to think things through." And he instantly became really aggressive and told me that he was going to get my mom to kick me out of the house. And I said, "Well, that's fine because I'm leaving." So I grabbed my bags and I left the church for good.
Good.
That was, I believe, November 16th of 2008.
And where did you go?
The first night I left the church, I actually slept on a coworker's floor in their house. I had nowhere to go, which was technically in violation of my parole because I was supposed to be at the residence that I had registered. So I slept on a coworker's floor. And the next day, actually, another coworker came to me and said, "Hey, my girlfriend and I are going to rent out our basement. Do you want to be a tenant?" And so it worked out really, really well. I rented the basement, and a couple of months later, while maintaining employment, I was able to get my very first apartment, connected with all the people who had left the church, my best friends, and they really helped me furnish my apartment and gave me so many life skills on, how to survive outside of the church because I had none. All I knew were the homeless shelters and from when I first left and then prison. And so I got to give it to them. They really, really, really helped me succeed on my own after I left the church. I needed a support group and they were my support group.
That's great. That's great that you were able to have a community to go to. Was this still in Illinois, or did you have to go far away?
This was still in Illinois. I just moved closer and closer to Chicago itself because Oregon, Illinois is 3 hours west of Chicago. And so when I left, I moved to the suburbs, had my own apartments, had my own job, and just gained the life skills needed. Ultimately, I had to rethink my belief system. I had grown up believing in perfection and believing in this group of people. But here, these group of people abused me so much that I couldn't believe in them anymore. And I didn't know what I believed spiritually. So it took a while to try to figure out what I believed in. I'm still figuring it out, I guess. But I went on a couple of mission trips to try to find some purpose or direction. And those were really great. They're amazing. It was my first time overseas and it was amazing. I really got to see how big the world was and the amazing people in it. And that there was more than this small group of 40 people in Illinois that were good. I saw and met, these just amazing people overseas that were just really, really, really good people. And it was just life changing. So I eventually made my way to Portland, Oregon, where I actually met my wife over in Africa. She was on a volunteer trip as well. And when we got back to the States, we moved to Portland and married in 2017. And we've been married 7 years now. And life is good. Still working through things, but
Good.
good. Yeah.
That's great. I'm so glad to hear that.
Thank you.
So, what do you want people to know about your experience? And if anyone's listening right now who's going through something similar, is there anything that you think you could say to them that might help?
Oh, there's so much, but I think what matters the most is that you should never be afraid to question your beliefs. If someone tells you that you don't get to question something that is written in the Bible or question your belief, then I think it's time to rethink your theology
Hmm.
because at that point it's just abusive. You got to be able to ask questions, and if you're not allowed to ask questions, then you got to figure something else out. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And more of you are speaking out now about the church.
Yeah, a lot of us are speaking out. We're less compliant and less likely to just, keep our mouths shut. We have spoken with different newspapers. There is a magazine article that is in the works right now and hopefully coming out later this year. I don't know when, but it's supposed to be a big article. So that'll be really great. And the idea really is just to share our stories and raise awareness, not only for ourselves to be able to hopefully bring justice to the survivors of cult abuse,
Hmm.
specifically with the group that I was in, but also for all those other people who might be on the fence of, is my religious group abusive? What do I think about it? Is it time to get out? Really, that's the question. Is it time to get out? Yeah.
Thank you so much for sharing your story.
Yeah. Thank you.
And I'm really sorry that you went through that.
Thank you. It means so much for people to hear me and understand and value my experiences. I never wish these experiences on anyone, but I'm where I am today because of those experiences. So yeah.
Thank you.
Generation Cult is hosted and produced by me, Dhyana Levey, with original music by Lee Dunn and opening and closing tune by the band The Cha. If you like the show, leave us a 5-star review. If you'd like to support it, we're on Patreon. You can sign up to receive early access and bonus features. If you want to reach us, send an email to generationcult@gmail.com.